Well, welcome back, and thank you for joining me once again. If you weren't with us yesterday, we began talking about destructive heresies, even heresies of such a kind that deny our sovereign Lord. In other words, they teach things that contradict, deny that Jesus is who he is, or they disown Christ altogether. Now, this is something that is happening on a fairly high level within American culture today. When you realize that only about half of evangelical pastors, I'm not even counting guys who wouldn't consider themselves evangelicals. I mean, in the mainline denominations like Presbyterians or the Methodists or Congregationalists and so forth. But I'm talking about people who basically say they're Bible-based Christians, and yet their view of the world is part through the Bible and part through the cultural moment they're in. And so as a consequence, they really evaluate whether or not a biblical passage applies based upon what the culture is saying is okay. In other words, they'll agree that it's wrong to steal, but then they may say because of social injustice, it's right for people of color to go into a grocery store and steal $995 worth of things. It's kind of a reparation for oppression, for slavery that took place long ago, even though those people have never been enslaved a day, a moment, or a minute, or a second in their entire life. But nonetheless, that's the way they kind of look at it. And they even look at things like divorce, and they say, well, if two people are incompatible, it just makes sense that they should seek to find their soulmate. And yet Jesus says what God's put together, don't let any man put asunder. And even the point where the Lord said in Malachi, I hate divorce. And so I can tell you quite honestly, and my wife would confirm it, my wife and I are married almost 55 years now because we determined that divorce was an option. Did we ever think about, boy, it'd sure be good to put some distance between ourselves and all that sort of stuff? Well, everybody has those thoughts. Everybody has those kind of thoughts of, maybe I married the wrong person. That's the reality. And you have this senseless idea that I need to find my soulmate. That romanticism came out of the 19th century and has no basis in reality. You don't have a soulmate out there. Your soul was made for Jesus. So if you want to have a soulmate, your soulmate is meant to be Jesus as the Holy Spirit comes into your heart and you're born again. But with regards to other people, you don't have a soulmate. What you have is a soul's obligation to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so, all this kind of nonsense gets filtered into the church, and it's amazing how much of it the church picks up. In fact, the role of psychology and faux science has been so impactful upon the seminaries that there's only about 8 seminaries left in the United States that teach biblical creationism. And even many of the presidents of those schools and teachers they're really not quite sure. They're kind of intimidated because they've never really taken the time to solidly study the issue. And so they're weak on that point. And so you'll find that pulpits will just avoid the book of Genesis, and they'll also avoid the book of Revelation. Well, the sad thing is that they end up, in many ways, denying even in what we call today deconstructionism. And deconstructionism is this movement within, it was particularly with a lot of millennial-age Christians to basically change their faith, reevaluate everything they believe, beginning with the idea that they don't completely accept the Bible as being authoritative. And so when they found themselves running into a cultural conflict, especially when they had people they liked and friends they wanted to hang out who were critical of them and calling them hypocritical and unloving and unkind and a hater and so forth and so on, they basically began to re-examine what they believed and reinterpret it so that it would coincide with whatever was going on within the culture. And that deconstructionism it has a biblical term. It's called backsliding. It's called apostasy. It's called a departure from the faith. But that's, most people don't want to say, well, I'm just a rank apostate. They want to say, well, I've deconstructed my faith. And I find in most of those cases, the people had a intellectual faith. They had an informational relationship with Jesus, but they didn't seem to have a life that was surrendered and committed to following him. Well, the danger with these kinds of things, Peter goes on to say that many will follow their shameful ways and bring the way of the truth into disrepute. It's fascinating to me. I was in India one time where I was reading an article in the Hindi Times, which was an English newspaper. They print it in English because the most common language in India, by the way, is English. It's spoken in all quarters of the country, whereas Hindi is only for those who are in certain part of the countries. And where I spent a lot of time in the South, they spoke Malayalam. In Tamil, the Tamil district, they spoke Tamil. So you find there are 16 different major religions in India, by the way, and then 16,000 dialects to those 16 major religions. So English, when it was, and because the country was controlled by the British for 300 years, is the common language. So here I am. I'm reading the Hindi Times, and it was a fascinating article because it was written by an evolutionary atheist who was making fun of Christians who teach evolutionary creationism. And what he was saying is, it doesn't make sense to be a Christian and believe in evolution. It doesn't make sense to be an evolutionist and say you're a Christian. They are antithetical. And he made his argument very soundly. And I thought to myself as I was reading this, I wish so many of my Christian friends who are progressive creationists or theistic evolutionists could actually read what the non-Christian actually thinks. You see, there's a thing that's happening within our intellectual quarters of the church all around, particularly, for example, when you look at Christian journalism like Christianity Today and other sorts of publications. The people who work at these organizations desperately want the approval of their peers in the secular world. It's true in the music world and the publishing world. They want to be viewed as being equal and as good as, and so they keep on finding ways, they say, to be salt and light in these people's lives. But the only way they can do that is to put something over the light and for the salt to lose its savor. They end up blending and becoming critics of Christianity as if that's going to get them some validity or some kind of acceptance within those quarters. That they begin to find themselves speaking against the church. And that's what a magazine like Christianity Today has become, really a polemic against Christianity. It promotes a kind of woke Christianity that I don't think is biblically centered anymore. And that's the whole idea. He says when you begin to let those heresies in, before long, many people will begin to follow them. It always has an attraction. And everybody's looking for an easier way and a cooler way and a more hip way and a more current way and a way that kind of puts us in the mainstream. And it's one of the things that people like myself and other pastors who kind of take a strong biblical stand, so much so that we're literally referred to now as biblicists. I take it as a compliment that we take the Bible not only literally, but we take it seriously. And we stand apart from those people because we look at certain behaviors that they're trying to make acceptable and we say, no, God calls those sin, and God says those will destroy you in this life, and then they'll take you to hell in the afterlife. And that's not very popular, especially with people who want to continue in those behaviors. I mean, when you think about that, there's a whole denomination of gay churches. I had a young man write me a letter of rebuke one time, and he said, I'm a gay Christian. And he grew up in our church, and he was the president of the LGBTQ club of one of our local Christian colleges. And I'm going, where did this go wrong? Well, it was really very simple. He was gay, and he wanted to find a way to hang on to his Christianity while he was gay, and so he bought into all the rationalizations and justifications along with the support of his parents. And so those kind of things happen, and they bring people in their own way, and they'll bring the truth that you believe the Bible is God's word into disrepute. Because one of the things we have to keep in mind is sin is always very attractive. Well, maybe not always, but it always has some form that you and I will find attractive. And that's why we have to sit saying, what would be the motivation behind doing something like that, going into some false doctrine? And it's interesting, in verse 3, Peter gives the answer. Here's what motivates them. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with stories they have made up. I mean, that is such a great statement, because what is it, greed? Greed is wanting to have something I'm not supposed to have. It's the reason Eve took the apple. or whatever the fruit was. It's greed taking something that we're not supposed to, it says do not touch, and we're taking it and we're keeping it for ourselves. We want to consume it upon ourselves. And what we find in terms of the sexuality within our culture is sexuality today has become very greedy. It's all about how can I consume pleasure from somebody else without allowing myself to ever be consumed. And it's a very predatory and cannibalistic type of relationship that we see growing in the world, which is the idea of how can I squeeze as much pleasure as I possibly can in this short moment of time without having to pay very much for it. And so essentially that's what drives them. They're driven by their own greed. And what they will do is they will exploit you. They will make stories up. Well, we're out of time again, and I'll hopefully be able to give you some more precise examples as we continue on this week. God bless you, and go in his wondrous grace.